And so my wife has a sign. It hangs over her desk, which is in our master bedroom, and it says this, and I copied it down for you guys. Be the type of mom that when your feet hit the floor in the morning, the devil runs away. The devil runs away. Good morning, everybody. Bear with me today. My voice is a little scratchy. I think it's allergies. Anybody else get that? Yeah, it drives me crazy right about, all the flowers look beautiful, the trees look beautiful, but really starts to beat me up and give me a headache and all that other stuff. Plus, I'm still struggling from my back, but we're not talking about all that stuff today, right? We're talking about moms. So if you're a mom, we're celebrating you today. And if you're not a mom, well, you had a mom, right? So we're celebrating our wives, of course, and our moms. I've been preaching through a series, and I thought what I would do is kind of put the two together. So the series is called The Struggle is Real, and it's been going on for a few weeks, and most of those sermons are on our website if you're interested in that. And it's just stuff that I think we struggle with all the time. But, when I chat with my mom, I hear about the struggles. And then I chat with my wife, I hear about the struggles. And who's ever heard of this thing called mommy guilt? Anybody heard of that? Yeah, it's like everybody's guilting everybody else. I'm like, man, it must be horrible to be a mom sometimes, even though it's a wonderful thing, right? There's all these crazy expectations, and I think you struggle against enough stuff already without having to compete against each other, but it seems like that happens as well. Anyway, if there's any kind of a struggle, it seems like it's really got to be about good and evil, really, when you kind of boil it all down. Are you thinking I'm right? There's good moms and there's evil moms, right? Oh, we're not getting into that today. I think that anyone who desires to please the Lord in the way that they raise their families, anybody who desires to please the Lord in the way they deal with life, really kind of will be often up against the world, be struggling against the world. So I want to remind everybody that our victory, this victory that, Kick and the folks are singing about, this victory is over the second death, okay? But it's not over trouble. In this world, we will have trouble, and Jesus said it over and over and over again. Last week, I preached a sermon called The Church, the struggles wield the church. This one, I'm just going to call this, A Mother's Work is Never Done. Is that true? Yeah, I know. It's just wild. No matter how many things me and the kids do, when my wife gets home, she'll find 5 or 10 other things that has to be done. And I just don't know how she gets it all done. I really don't. She does mountains of laundry and doesn't complain about it. Very much, Anyway, it seems like a mother's work is never done. Anyway, what is a sweater? I looked up a few things that moms are famous for. What is a sweater? A sweater is something that you wear when your mother is cold. Okay, I guess you guys didn't like that one. There's this guy, Larry. Larry's mother had 4 children. Her children were named North, South, East, and... No, I already told you, Larry. What did the mother bullet say to the daddy bullet? We're going to have a baby. Okay, I guess you guys didn't like that. And what did the mother say to the son? If you fall out of that tree and break your legs, do not come running to me. Every mom has said that. Anyway, moms, we acknowledge you today. We acknowledge you that, we love you. We acknowledge that your job is difficult. And frankly, I think that it's just gotten harder over the years. I think that the struggle is super real for you. When I was sitting down thinking, hey, Mother's Day is one of those things that every year you have to come up with a sermon, and you want to do a good job, and not everyone preaches out of Proverbs 31, although sooner or later everyone gets to it, right? You've got to have something new. And while I was just thinking about, my mom, my wife, my grandmother, on both sides, I remember something that really kind of startled me with my mother's mother, and this is about maybe 35 years ago. So we went to Oklahoma where she lived, and she's passed away now. But I had my daughter, Christina, and I was super proud to go and show my grandmother, another grandchild or great-grandchild. And, she was super loving, and she was excited about it, and she was deep into her 90s then, but she still had all her faculties. But she said something that really just kind of shocked me. She said, Jimmy, I just don't know if I would bring any more people into this earth. And I thought, why would she say that? It just struck me as weird. And, here's my grandmother, and I'm thinking, my grandmother loves Jesus. My grandmother is super pro-life, obviously. She loves her children. She loves her grandchildren. She's lived through pain and struggle. One of her daughters had died. Just all these things. And I'm like, why would she say, I don't know if I would bring any more children into this world? And, it kind of shocked me. But the more I thought about it, what she was not saying was anything about the children that we have. Surely she loves them all. What she was saying is she was really indicting this world. She wasn't saying that children weren't wonderful. She said, I'm not sure I would bring any more children into this world. Into this world. And I've been sharing with you, Jesus said in this world we will have trouble, right? But he says he has overcome the world. My mother or my grandmother lived through the Great Depression, and some of us, I'm certainly not that old, but some of us have a little bit of knowledge of that, the Great Depression. I don't know why, but this week I was thinking about what my grandmother said, and I started reading up on the Great Depression. My wife is a history teacher, and so I asked her some questions about it, and she said, well, it was 1929 to 1939, and you think being mom was difficult, what about back then, just trying to feed everybody. And I started thinking and writing things down that my grandmother would not have had in 1929, maybe into 1939. So first of all, she wouldn't have had a microwave, right? Right. She wouldn't have had a microwave. When I was a kid, we had a cook stove that we had to get up in the morning, chop some kindling, and get it going. Okay, it was a cook stove that you actually had to chop wood and put it in there. And so my grandmother had something even older than that. And so there's a lot of struggles going on. She clearly didn't have a washer dry well. Back then they had the old ringer washer, right? Washer, that's how they said it, right? And then you hung the stuff out on the line, and then you would bring it in and, break it and fold it back up. So they had to do all that kind of stuff. They didn't have really, I think that they probably had electricity in my grandmother's house. I'm not certain of it, but they certainly didn't have a phone until later. This week, my secretary and I were talking about party lines. Who remembers party lines, right? If you lived way out in the middle of nowhere, like my grandmother did, you hear the phone ring and you go to get it. She's like, nope, don't answer that. That's the party line. That's the neighbor's line, right? But if you accidentally picked it up, you could hear the neighbors talking to whoever they're talking to. So they had a phone maybe, but probably not during the Great Depression. Of course, there was no television, and most of them had almost no education. Now, was life better then or worse? They had really not a whole lot going on, even in the Great Depression. Was life better then or worse? Because in lots of ways, even though they didn't have much, it was way better. And certainly the way God would kind of look at it. Because there's one of the things that they did not have to deal with. They didn't have to deal with this filth that comes into our televisions, right? And we pay money to pump it into the house. We pay money to do it. She didn't have to deal with maybe the internet, right? I was in the military. The internet didn't even come out that long ago. What was it, 30 years maybe? And then all of a sudden, boom, it's like everywhere, and it's just dragging this stuff into your house. My grandmother never worked outside of the home. Certainly she was super busy, but a lot of times, our moms or our grandmoms didn't have jobs outside the home, and still they were super, super, super busy, and they were dealing with all these kind of stuff. But what I'm trying to say is there are several things now that moms have to deal with this very day that are way, way more difficult than 50 years ago. And there's no doubt about it. I got a list. It's not an all-inclusive list, but I just have a few things that I thought I would just show you examples of how difficult it is if you don't already know. A couple weeks ago, I talked about sexual immorality in the world and maybe even in the church. And certainly that's always existed, yes. It's been around for a long time. But today, a mom trying to raise up a child or a couple children in this world has to deal with the reality of it. Pornography is ubiquitous. That's a big word. That means it's everywhere. You cannot get away from it unless you specifically make sure that you're never around it. You have to be super careful. And moms have to deal with that stuff. It's all over the place. They said that the average child sees hardcore pornography at the age of 7. 7 years old. I don't know what I was doing when I was 7, but I know it wasn't pornography. You know, it was climbing a tree and getting threatened by my mother or whatever. But that is the reality of the world today. If your children are not right there with you, you're not sure what's going to be happening with them. And then you think you send them to school and they won't see that stuff. Oh, you're wrong. In fact, a lot of teachers, and one of them, I'm not picking on teachers, but I read a story this week about a teacher who was very flamboyant with the gay and lesbian thing and was pushing it on the children, and they were third graders. They were third graders. And the teacher did not get fired. This was in this news this very week. She did not get fired. They just moved her to middle school, where it was more appropriate. And I thought, oh my goodness gracious, you know, what is going on? Did you know people are not getting married like they used to? Back when my grandmother, you know, even my mother were young, people just got married. That's the way you did it. They didn't necessarily do it all right, but they generally got married. And I was looking up some statistics on marriage today. Did you know that 25% of millennials, it is predicted, will never marry? 25%. I got a statistic here. It just shows how it's falling off, like marriage and stuff. Marriage is what holds our society together. It's the basis of a foundation for a family. And instead of what we have this thing called this hookup culture. And I was reading about that sometime this week. There's this recent study by Graylow, whoever Graylow is. It showed that 70% of 12 to 21-year-olds, now I know that's a wide swath, but 12 to 21-year-olds, 70% indicated that they had engaged in at least one uncommitted sexual encounter with someone else that they had no ties in the last 12 months. And I started looking into that more. I was like, it's a lot more on the age 12, 13, 14 age than you really would think. When you would think that, you know, that kind of stuff wouldn't be going on. In 1938, for example, back in the Great Depression, 11% of African American children were born out of wedlock. Today, do you know what that number is? It's 75%. 75%. It's not good for anyone, really, but in 1938, I looked this up, 3% of Caucasian children were born out of wedlock. Today, it's 30%. 30%. I'm not great at math, but that is a huge increase. Things like STDs, and, you know, why are you talking about this in a sermon? Because I just had a conversation with my sons the other night. I'm like, listen, I need to talk to you guys. These are kids that are 15 to 16, 17-year-olds. I'm like saying, listen to me. I just had someone in my office the other day. They have a girlfriend who's pregnant. And then they have an ex-girlfriend who has a child. And then they have an ex-girlfriend who has a child. And so the one mom is getting half of their income, and the other mom is getting the other half of the income, and rightfully so, right? They have children. And now he's got this other girl who wants to know what. And I'm like, you don't have to do this to yourself. You don't have to do this to yourself. If you walk with the Lord in all of your ways, if you do things the right way, you won't be coming and sitting down going, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how to do. You know, how am I going to live with this? And then you get into things like STDs, right? I mean, okay, so somebody didn't get pregnant. This is from CNN. I think I got this on the screen. In 2016, Americans were infected with more than 2 million new cases of gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, and the highest number of these sexually transmitted disease ever reported. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said, clearly we have to reverse this disturbing trend, said Dr. Gail Boland, director of the CDC's Division of STD Prevention. The CDC cannot do this alone, and we need every community in America to be aware that the risk is out there and to help educate their citizens on how to avoid it. I would change that to children. You have got to educate our children, but why? Because it's perilous. What goes on in the world that we send our children into, and I've said many times, how are we going to raise our children in this cesspool? How are we going to do it? Because it is everywhere. It is all around. And that's the struggle that anyone who has, you know, a desire to raise their children to love the Lord is going to have to deal with. There's other things like poverty. Jesus himself said, you would always have the poor among you. Did he say that? Yes, he did. But think about this for a minute. When you were poor in the Great Depression, maybe you wouldn't have, you know, much to eat. Maybe you weren't sure of what you would have to eat, you know. But people didn't really starve to death because charities and churches took care of them. Right? Do you know that during those days we didn't have a whole lot of homelessness like we do now? There was some, and I looked this up. They called them shanty towns, but they were specifically called Hooverville in honor of President Hoover, who they said was the reason that they were all homeless. There was some of that going on, but for the most part, churches and charities were able to provide the help that people needed. Have you ever heard of an organization called the YMCA? Right? Oh, it actually was starting in Great Britain or in the United Nations, YWCA. You know, now the YMCA, frankly, it seems like it's a gym and a babysitter for the most part. But it actually started to be a young man's Christian association. And the YWCA obviously was the Young Women's Christian Association. And they were to help build up a society with Christian values. But now, honestly, if you go down to the YWCA in Dayton and you just look at what's hanging on their walls, it is absolutely godless. It is the opposite of what a young Christian woman should be being taught. And so, mothers, are you having to deal with that? I guarantee that you are. Social Security. Social Security came out in 1935. It was during the Great Depression. It kind of set the thing off. And when it first started out, it was supposed to be some kind of a help, right? What do we call that now? Excuse me? It's an entitlement. Before it was a charity, it was help. Now it's an entitlement. And I understand that, you know, it's our money that we put it in there. But the reality is we take back a whole lot more than we ever put in there. And so my point was just that, you know, now it's an entitlement. Food stamps begin in 1964, so when I was a little bit of a young man. What's interesting to me by that is, you know, it was to help people. But do you know that now a full 25% of Americans get food stamps? 25%. Now, some people need it. You know, they absolutely, positively need it. But are we really in a society where 25% of us need help from the government to feed ourselves? We're the richest country in the nation. That doesn't make any sense. We're the richest country in the world. In fact, we're the richest country that's ever been in the world. And so it just makes me wonder what in the world is going on. And I'm not really saying anything about food stamps. I was raised on food stamps. Read my testimony. You'll see that without some of that help, we would not have made it because my mother was married over and over and over again. Not the Christian way to do it. Eventually married 5 times. And so without some of this help, we probably wouldn't have made it. Let me throw something else in here. Because I think this is really what happened. At least in my life, my grandmothers both went to church. My grandfathers both went to church. But when my mother and my father decided as teenagers to elope and come back, guess what first thing they decided that they didn't want to do? They didn't want to go to church. And so church attendance has been one of the biggest problems. In the last 60 years, I have a slide here. This is the decline of church going in the last 60 years. And so you don't just have this culture pushing, but you also have this withdrawal from the church, which is the one thing, right, that could probably do some actual good. Here's a quote from Tom Rainer. I love this guy. He used to pastor in a church where I was, and now he's a big highfalutin doctor. I can't even call him anymore. He said this. He does a lot of research on churches. Between 8,000 and 10,000 churches will close this year. Will close this year. Now, he said that in 2013. I just talked to his assistant the other day. He's a friend of mine. He's also a PhD. These numbers are not getting better. Churches are being shuttered over and over and over again. In fact, this church right here, the building closed down as the Presbyterians left and we, are a startup church. So there's not that many churches being started, and frankly, it's very difficult to do it. But that's kind of where we're at. Another study that I dug up the other day says that 89% of Americans say they believe in God. 89% of Americans say they believe in God. Well, I'm sorry for that 11% who don't. But then why are they not going to church? You put those two things together and they don't make any sense. And I'm like, is this the problem? Is this the actual problem? And so what I did is I dug up a prophecy about what I believe is today. I dug up a prophecy where Paul spoke to his young protege, Timothy, about terrible times, perilous times in the last days. I asked you last week, do you believe we're in the last days? Well, here we go. 2 Timothy chapter 3. Read this with me. 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5. But mark this, Paul says to Timothy, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with such people. Here's how I put it together. Did you hear what he says? Having a form of godliness but denying its power? They believe in God. 89% of them say they believe in God, but they don't believe in an actual God that can do anything. They believe in some theoretical God that's like distant and not involved. What I'm trying to tell you is the same God who got up out of that grave and is our Savior is still desperately wanting to be involved in our lives. And what are we doing is we just push back. It's like we don't even want to do it anymore. And so I'm like, how are we going to do this, moms? How are we going to do this, families? Clearly, one mom can't change the world, right? Oh. Maybe one mom can change the world, because certainly one mom can change everything about how she supports her family, yes? And one mom can push back on the culture, and I have seen it happen. And I'm not talking about helicopter moms. My voice is killing me right now. Helicopter moms, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about saying, no, we're going to do things this way. Just one mom can change how effective her husband is at work. I guarantee you that. She can change how her children do at school. Just one mom can really, honestly, frankly, change the eternities of her very children. Now, I'm not saying we don't have free will and that people don't have choices. I'm just saying that if your mother is sold out, and I'm not talking about Jesus all the time when people are looking and then blankety blank the rest of the time. I'm talking about when you love Jesus with your whole heart in front of your children. It is impossible not to catch that. It's impossible. And so my wife has a sign. It hangs over her desk, which is in our master bedroom, and it says this, and I copied it down for you guys. Be the type of mom that when your feet hit the floor in the morning, the devil runs away. The devil runs away. I'm going to close with Proverbs 31, but I went through this week, and I don't know, maybe my wife told me that I was like the only guy in the whole world that didn't notice this, but the end of Proverbs 31 talks about this amazing mom and wife and mother and stuff, and I said, I don't really like to preach that stuff because you throw that out there and it's like every mom's already got guilt, right? Why are you putting this on her? And I just noticed that it's not really a real woman. It's not really a real woman. It is probably a conglomerate of women that this king, not Solomon, a different king, Lemuel was his name, his mother wrote this down and made him memorize it. Now I'm talking about, this is the kind of thing moms used to do, right? And I think maybe we should do some more of this. She wrote this poem down, which became a proverb, which is words of God to us. And she said, son, you're going to be a king. Memorize this. And here it is, Proverbs 31. This is the last few verses. Who can find a virtuous and capable wife? She is more precious than rubies. Is that the opposite of the 2 Timothy chapter 3 thing? Right. It says, her husband can trust her, and she will greatly enrich his life. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She finds wool and flax and busily spins it. She's like a merchant ship, bringing her food from afar. She gets up before dawn to prepare breakfast for her household and plan the day's work for her servant girls. Those would not have been slaves. They're just people that work there. She goes to inspect a field and buys it. With her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She is energetic and strong and a hard worker. She makes sure her dealings are profitable. Her lamp burns late into the night. Her hands are busy spinning thread, her fingers twisting fiber. She extends a helping hand to the poor and opens her arms to the needy. She has no fear of winter for her household, for everyone has warm clothes. She makes her own bedspreads. She dresses up in fine linen and purple gowns. Her husband is well known at the city gates where he sits with the other civic leaders. She makes belted linen garments and sashes to sell to merchants. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs about the fear of the future. When she speaks, her words are wise, and she gives instruction with kindness. She carefully watches everything in her household and suffers nothing from laziness. Her children stand and bless her. Her husband praises her. There are many virtuous and capable women in the world, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive, and beauty does not last, but a woman who fears the Lord will greatly be praised, or will greatly be praised. Reward her for all she has done. Let her deeds publicly declare her praise. Now, is that enough mommy guilt for you? You know what I got when I read this? I got this cool thing. I'm like, this mom wrote this. She made her son memorize it. But then when I start thinking of what I see on television and magazines, and when I start, just thinking about the stuff that happens, people coming to me for help, or just out there in society, or even some things that goes on in my family, and maybe some of the things that, go on in our community, I don't see very many of these women. I just don't. I told somebody a couple years ago, I said, I'm going to write a book. I'm working on a couple different things, but one of them, I'm going to write this book called Where's the Titus 2 Women? Well, I'm not trying to guilt you. I'm just saying Titus, in the book of Titus, it says older women teach the younger women. Older women should teach the younger women. And I just want to say to the church, where are they? We've had several generations of people just say, we're not coming to church. And then you got a couple other generations that say, okay, we'll come, but we're not going to do anything. And then I'd say, this is where we're left. This is where we're left. But the woman who fears the Lord, she doesn't have to toot her own horn, does she? A woman who fears the Lord, she doesn't have to brag or boast. She doesn't have to say, hey, look at all the things I did. Her own works praise her. Her own children praise her. Her own family praises her. Her own husband praises her. I think that's the coolest thing about that. But when I look out in society, that's not what I see. I see us all doing that 2 Timothy stuff, struggling and bragging and boasting and all that stuff, and it's just not what's supposed to be. When people see the children of a virtuous woman, they see her. They see a reflection of her. I love that. We have a pact in my family. All the kids that are home, when we go out to a restaurant or when we're out in public anywhere, if anyone comes up and says, your children are well behaved, they all get a treat. It's cost me a fortune. I mean, people have cost me a fortune, right? Because we're not beating them to get them that way. It's just, and people come up and they'll say, well, how come your kids are so good? How did you do that? And I always say, well, we read a book about it. Really? You read a book? I said, yeah, it's the Holy Bible. I honest to God do that just because I kind of want to shake people a little bit, There is an actual book about it, and if you read it, it will change things. Anyway, let me encourage you moms out there. Let me encourage you that God doesn't need you to be Proverbs 31 woman. He doesn't need you to do all that. What he wants you to do and needs you to do is just to embrace him, because that's how you become that woman. It's not about you anymore. It's all about her. God does never call anyone to be perfect. He calls you to walk in his perfection. That's the whole deal. And so I know when you're reading the mommy guilt thing, you're probably like, I can't do that. I'm like, you don't need to do that. All you need to do is walk in his perfection. And he molds you. It's not by your power or by your might. It's by his Spirit, declares the Lord. Yes? And so moms, in the busyness that you have, which is unbelievable, unfortunately, one of the first things that falls away is any time alone. I know you can't even go to the bathroom. I know that, right? The note comes under the door. I know that. You have to be able to do it, and you have to be able to do it with the Lord. You have to. You don't be afraid to let your children see you saying, listen, Mom and Jesus are going to spend some time together. Don't make it, when people come over and they see Mom with the Bible out, say, what's that, Mom? It should be an automatic thing. And so I'm just encouraging you to do that. Let your children see it. Read the Bible. Dive into it. Meditate it. Spend time with the Lord. Memorize the scriptures. And what will happen is it just starts to come out of you. And when you compare with what God's word says, with what the world is doing, you'll know if you're on the right side or not. You will. And then you'll be able to encourage other women. Titus 2, right? Older women. It doesn't necessarily mean older. It just means the one they're stronger in the Lord. The ones that have been walking with the Lord longer will encourage the other one. And the last thing I got to say is this. Keep your eyes firmly fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our soul, of our faith. Yes? Because he's the one, he's the finisher. He's the one who does the whole thing. Friends, I'm just closing. The band's going to come up, but I just want to encourage you with one last verse. Jesus said this, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Heavenly Father, thank you for those comforting words in a difficult time. Father, I pray for the families in this congregation. First of all, just thank you, Lord, that you give us children, you put us into families. Help us to do it your way and in your will. And Father, I pray today if there's anyone here that's just struggling, if there's anyone here who does not know you as their Lord and Savior, that today they would reach out for help. And I pray it in Jesus' name.